You know, when a fire alarm goes off in a crowded building, the physical reaction is it's instantaneous. Your heart rate spikes, your pupils dilate, and adrenaline just completely floods your system.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, biology is basically screaming at you to run for the exit. It's a primal, hardwired imperative, right? You either run or you stay and burn.
Right, the ultimate binary choice. I mean, total self-preservation takes over, and it completely bypasses your conscious thought process.
Exactly. But what happens when the alarm isn't a shrieking siren? What if the alarm is the quiet, sinking realization that, say, a corporate spreadsheet has been deliberately doctored?
Ooh.
Or, you know, a deeply inappropriate comment was just made in a meeting. The thing is, your biology does the exact same thing. The cortisol spikes, your palms get sweaty, but suddenly running for the exit isn't the solution. It's actually the problem.
Because suddenly we're not talking about outrunning a physical fire. We're talking about having to consciously override our own DNA to stand our ground. The threat isn't physical combustion anymore. It's social or professional annihilation.
Which is terrifying in its own right. Welcome to Speak Up English Hub, everyone. For all of you joining us today, we are embarking on a really in-depth exploration of a profoundly impactful concept. This is an advanced analytical session designed to challenge your listening skills, and we're drawing from the audiobook and text of Ryan Holiday's Courage is Calling.
And our mission today, just for you listening, isn't to just hand you some standard dictionary definition of courage. We want to meticulously deconstruct its anatomy.
Yes.
We want to understand its natural enemy and figure out the actual practical mechanics of habituating bravery in your daily life.
To do that, I think we really have to start by breaking down a paradigm that almost all of us accept without even questioning it. Society has this deeply ingrained habit of categorizing courage into, well, two distinct separate buckets.
Right, the classic split. On one side, you have physical courage. This is your firefighter charging into the blaze, the soldier navigating a battlefield, or, the person diving into a freezing river to save a dog. It's very visceral.
Very visual. And then on the other side, you have moral courage. That's the whistleblower defying corporate culture, or the person who speaks truth to power at the risk of absolute scandal. But Holiday argues that this distinction is, well, it's a complete illusion.
He really dismantles that paradigm entirely. When you strip away the external context, whether it's smoke and flames or whispers, and corporate sabotage courage of all stripes boils down to one ubiquitous truth.
Which is?
That it is the act of taking a risk, enduring danger, and willingly putting yourself in peril. The medium changes, sure, but the internal mechanism required to act is exactly the same.
The sources bring up the classic myth of Hercules at the crossroads to illustrate this, which I think is fascinating because, pop culture usually paints Hercules as this muscle-bound, spontaneous brawler just romping his way through ancient Greece.
Right, the Disney version.
Exactly. But before the 12 Labors, before the legendary fame, he was just a young man standing at a literal intersection in the woods presented with a fundamental choice.
He was approached by two goddesses, right, and each was offering a distinct path.
Yeah, so the first goddess was lavishly dressed, very alluring, and she offered him the path of vice. Her promise was this completely risk-free life of ease, absolute pleasure, and untroubled peace.
Sounds pretty tempting.
Doesn't it? She promised there would be no pain, no deprivation, no struggle whatsoever, just, perpetual comfort.
But then you have the second goddess, and she was dressed plainly, with a very severe demeanor. She offered the path of virtue, which in ancient Greek translates to Arete, or excellence.
And her promise was incredibly stern.
Completely. She didn't offer comfort at all. She offered a life of severe struggle, relentless hard work, and ubiquitous danger. But the ultimate reward, if he could endure the thorns, was glory, true greatness.
And he hesitated, obviously, weighing the comfort against the struggle. But ultimately, he chose the thorny path of virtue. I mean, I understand the philosophical weight of the myth, but let me play devil's advocate for a second here.
Sure, go for it.
I'm struggling to reconcile this whole duality as an illusion idea. Is it really accurate to conflate these types of courage? Like, let's go back to the burning building versus the corporate boardroom.
Okay.
Jumping into a fire threatens your actual life. Speaking up in a meeting threatens your livelihood, sure, or your reputation. I get the analogy that courage is like a muscle, and, a muscle doesn't care if you're deadlifting heavy weights at the gym or carrying heavy groceries up 3 flights of stairs.
Right, it only recognizes resistance.
Exactly, it only recognizes resistance. But are the stakes really comparable enough to call them the exact same thing?
Well, it all comes back to the nervous system's interpretation of risk. The muscle of character only recognizes the resistance of stepping into danger. Look at it from an evolutionary standpoint.
Okay.
Being ostracized from your tribe, which is exactly what social or professional ruin feels like today, was historically just as fatal as being eaten by a predator.
Because if the tribe casts you out, you starve.
Precisely. So the internal mechanism required to overcome the terror of the boardroom is biologically identical to the mechanism required to face a physical threat.
Okay, that makes sense. But if we accept that courage is simply the act of facing resistance and choosing the thorny path, it begs a rather depressing question.
Why is it so rare?
Right. If virtue and entheite are the ultimate goals, why don't we all just choose the thorny path every time we're at a crossroads?
Because the thorns hurt. I mean, it's that simple. And that brings us to the natural enemy of courage. We were talking about fear, or, as the ancient Greeks personified it, Phobos.
It's so crucial to establish right away what courage actually means in relation to fear. It's so easy for us to look at a brave person and assume they possess some kind of, I don't know, superhuman immunity to being terrified.
Right, like their biology is just different.
Yeah, but courage is not the absence of terror. It is the act of prevailing despite it.
There is an incredible historical anecdote in the sources that perfectly illustrates how to handle Phobos. It involves the Athenian statesman and general Pericles. So he's out leading his naval fleet, and suddenly a massive eclipse occurs, and it's followed by this severe thunderstorm.
And we really have to put ourselves in the minds of ancient soldiers here. A sudden darkening of the sun and violent thunder wasn't just a low-pressure weather system to them.
Not at all.
It was perceived as a terrible portent. It was a direct, undeniable sign of the god's wrath. So his highly trained soldiers just dropped their weapons. They were completely paralyzed by supernatural terror.
Yeah, so Pericles basically has a mutiny of fear on his hands. And what does he do? He doesn't give some rousing motivational speech about bravery. He bends down, grabs two large rocks, and simply bangs them together in front of his men. Yeah, and by doing that, he fundamentally altered their psychological state. He didn't have a modern meteorological understanding of barometric pressure to explain to them, but he logically demonstrated that thunder is just the noise of physical elements colliding in the atmosphere.
Exactly like the rocks in his hands.
Right. He took this boundless supernatural terror and reduced it to a basic, predictable law of physics.
He used logic to demystify the threat. And that gets to the absolute core of why fear paralyzes us. It's the vagueness.
Oh, 100%.
When a threat is shadowy, nebulous, and undefined, the human mind just magnifies it to catastrophic proportions. Our brains love to fill in the dark corners with the absolute worst-case scenarios.
Because when you can clearly see the edges of a problem, you can establish its limits. You can plan for it. But a nebulous fear is boundless. You can't fight a ghost.
No, you can't.
And that is exactly why the Stoic philosophers, particularly Seneca, practiced this mental exercise called Premeditatio Malorum, which translates to the premeditation of evils.
It's basically the practice of clearly defining the absolute worst things that could happen to you. And modern thinkers like Tim Ferriss have actually adapted this into a framework he calls fear setting.
Yeah, and the sources mention the industrialist John D. Rockefeller utilizing exactly this strategy. At the height of his success, he would constantly pause and ask himself, suppose the oil fields gave out.
He wasn't being pessimistic, though.
No, he wasn't defeating himself. He was purposefully illuminating the absolute worst-case scenario so that if market panics happened, he wouldn't be caught off guard.
But let me challenge this concept for a second. I hear Premeditatio Malorum, and I think, isn't that just an ancient justification for catastrophic thinking?
It's a common reaction.
Like, how do you routinely premeditate all the disasters that could ruin your life without just spiraling into a state of absolute paralyzing anxiety?
Well, that is the exact trap people fall into when they misunderstand this Stoic practice. The distinction lies in the mechanism of the exercise. Catastrophic thinking is entirely passive. It's letting fear run wild in the shadows of your subconscious. You're allowing the amygdala to exaggerate and misconstrue the danger without any logical pushback. Premeditatio Malorum, on the other hand, is highly active.
So it's sort of the difference between worrying about a monster under the bed versus turning on the flashlight, looking under the bed, and measuring exactly how big the monster actually is.
Precisely. You are deliberately establishing the exact boundaries of the threat. You aren't wallowing in the fear, you are weighing it.
Right.
And what people like Rockefeller and Seneca found is that once you clearly define the worst-case scenario, losing your money, losing your status, you realize that it has limits. It is finite,
Yeah.
and more importantly, you realize it is something you can likely endure and recover from.
So we've utilized logic to shrink our nebulous fears down to a manageable size. We've banged the rocks together, so to speak. We know the monster isn't supernatural, but seeing the limits of a threat doesn't automatically move your feet forward.
No, it doesn't.
How do we actually compel ourselves to take action? I feel like the trap we fall into is thinking that habituating bravery requires these massive theatrical leaps of faith every single day.
And that is a very pervasive myth, and it's honestly why so many people remain paralyzed. Courage is not built by waiting around for a single cinematic grand gesture. It is forged through small, habituated steps.
Like Aristotle said.
Exactly. The philosopher Aristotle famously argued that we become builders by building. We become harpists by playing the harp. Therefore, the only way we become brave is by doing brave things time after time in small increments.
Florence Nightingale is a phenomenal example of this from the sources. I mean, today we look back at her as this towering, revolutionary figure who single-handedly modernized the nursing profession.
Right.
But we forget her context. She was a 19th century English gentlewoman. She was completely daunted by the incredibly restrictive, inflexible societal norms of her time. In the Victorian era, hospitals were places of squalor and disease.
They were horrific.
For a woman of her aristocratic social standing, to even set foot in one was considered entirely inappropriate. It was scandalous.
She was facing the very real threat of social ruin. Her family was appalled. She didn't just wake up one morning, overcome her fear in one fell swoop, and declare she was going to permanently alter the course of global medical history.
No, the prospect of that would have been way too nebulous, too massive. Her audacity started quite discreetly. She didn't burn her bridges all at once. She took one small, courageous micro-step.
Which was?
She committed to working in a hospital for just one single summer. That was the extent of it. But enduring the social friction of that one summer habituated the fortitude she needed to take the next step and then the next until she redefined an entire profession.
And sometimes, the window to exercise that habituated fortitude is remarkably brief. The sources highlight a really gripping moment from the 1960 U.S. presidential election.
Oh, this is a great story.
Martin Luther King Jr. had been arrested during a sit-in in Georgia. He was denied bail and abruptly transferred to a state prison. He was facing terrifying, very real prospects on a chain gang. His safety was in immediate jeopardy.
And the political stakes were incredibly high. MLK's wife, Coretta Scott King, was frantically reaching out to the camps of both major presidential candidates, Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy.
Now, the context here is vital for you listening. Nixon was actually friends with King. He had established relationships and the political capital to act. But he looked at the situation, weighed the potential backlash from his Southern conservative voter base, and he prevaricated.
He hesitated.
He hesitated and ultimately chose silence to protect his political standing.
Kennedy, on the other hand, was warned by his advisors to stay out of it, but he took a massive political risk. However, the mechanics of that risk are what we really need to focus on. JFK didn't launch a massive public campaign or give a sweeping televised address.
No, he didn't.
He made a few quick phone calls. He called the governor of Georgia. He called the judge. He called Coretta Scott King to offer support. It was a micro-action that took mere minutes.
But the ripple effect of that micro-action was seismic. King was eventually released, the black community rallied behind Kennedy, and he won an incredibly tight election.
So what does this reveal about the anatomy of courage? It reveals that sometimes bravery literally only takes 30 seconds of your time.
Exactly 30 seconds.
It is the exact ephemeral amount of time it takes to hit send on a difficult email, to dial the phone for a controversial conversation, or to look your boss in the eye and say, I disagree.
Right.
But I'm struggling to reconcile this with the broader idea of excellence. We're championing 30-second microactions, sending an email, making a call, but aren't we just lowering the bar?
How do you mean?
Well, Thomas Edison famously said that life is too short to bother with small things. How do we know we aren't just patting ourselves on the back for sending a slightly edgy email, using it as an excuse to play it safe while avoiding the real Herculean choices?
That's a fair point. But if we look at the underlying mechanics of Edison's philosophy and Nightingale's actions, they actually synthesize perfectly. Edison is right. You absolutely should not waste your life on trivialities. But Nightingale's small step was not trivial. JFK's phone call was not trivial.
Right.
The key takeaway is not the initial size or duration of the step, but the trajectory of the step.
Ah, so it's about where the action is pointed.
Exactly. The momentum of a small 30-second step in a monumental direction is what actually matters. The hardest part of courage is breaking the inertia of fear. A 30-second micro-action acts as the wedge that cracks the door open. Once the inertia is broken, momentum takes over.
Okay, so we are using logic to measure our fears. We are habituating bravery by taking those 30-second leaps, building our character muscle. But what happens when that habituated bravery is directed entirely away from our own success?
That's the real question.
Yeah. What happens when the courage transcends personal ambition, professional survival, or even physical survival, and is pointed entirely toward the survival of someone else?
Then we arrive at the absolute apex of courage. We elevate from standard bravery into its rarest, highest form, which is heroism.
Heroism is a word we throw around very casually today. We use it to describe, I don't know, an athlete who scores a winning touchdown or a musician who drops a great album.
Well, constantly.
But Holiday defines it strictly. Heroism is making sacrifices for the welfare of others, plain and simple. It is total selflessness. It is what the ancient Greeks referred to as megalopsuchia, which translates to greatness of soul.
And contrary to the Hollywood image, true megalopsuchia is often deeply unglamorous and completely unrecognized by the public. The sources highlight the almost entirely forgotten story of Stanley Levinson.
Such a powerful example.
He was a crucial foundational figure for Martin Luther King Jr. during the Civil Rights Movement. He drafted major speeches, he organized massive fundraising campaigns, and he was instrumental in the movement's early organizational success.
But then, the Cold War paranoia reached a fever pitch. JFK explicitly warned King that Levinson was accused of having communist sympathies by the FBI. The government essentially told King that associating with Levinson could completely destroy the credibility of the entire civil rights movement.
Just imagine that.
Right. Put yourself in Levinson's shoes for a second. You have poured your life, your energy, your soul into this righteous cause. The natural, human, self-preserving instinct would be to scream your innocence. You would demand loyalty from your friend King. You would fight tooth and nail to keep your spot at the table.
Of course.
Yeah?
But Levinson bypassed his own ego entirely. He didn't put King in the agonizing position of having to choose between his friend and his movement. Levinson heroically and quietly stepped away.
Just left.
He severed ties, voluntarily erasing himself from the narrative in the history books to ensure that his mere presence wouldn't tarnish the cause he loved. That is altruism in its purest, most painful form.
The sources use a fantastic sports metaphor to illustrate this dynamic. For every glory-seeking Michael Jordan hitting the legendary buzzer beater while the crowd goes wild, you fundamentally need a selfless Bill Cartwright, his co-captain, doing the grueling, physical, uncelebrated work in the background.
Yep. Cartwright took the elbows, he set the screens, and he absorbed the punishment just to make the rest of the team taller and stronger.
Lord Byron penned a quote that really anchors this entire concept. "'Tis the cause makes all." An instructor at the U.S. Naval Academy explains this philosophy beautifully to his midshipmen. He tells them that jumping on a live grenade is an act of supreme physical courage.
Definitely.
Your biology screams at you to run away, but you override it and jump on the explosive. But, he notes, it only actually matters. It only achieves the sacred status of heroism if you are doing it to save the person standing next to you.
Wow.
Raw courage, without a noble cause or the intent to protect others, is ultimately hollow. It's just thrill-seeking.
So heroism isn't just being the lone protagonist in an action movie, walking away from an explosion in slow motion while the credits roll. It's actually being the mortar between the bricks.
I love that.
It is the invisible, unglamorous adhesive that holds the structure together so that others can safely stand on top of it. If we analyze it through the lens of evolutionary biology, heroism is a complete paradox.
How so?
Well, evolution demands self-preservation above all else so that you can pass on your genes. Heroism actively defies that deeply ingrained instinct. It is the conscious decision to risk your own survival to ensure that the collective thrives. It is the defining moment. A human being transcends their own hardwiring for the benefit of the whole.
Taking these selfless, brave stands sounds incredibly noble and inspiring when we dissect them in an analytical session like this, but the source material leaves us with a very stark, very sobering warning. about the immediate aftermath of choosing that thorny path of virtue.
Yeah, we really have to prepare you for the reality of the wilderness, because despite what the movies show us, the brave are rarely welcomed by society immediately.
No, they aren't.
When you challenge the status quo, when you point out the doctored spreadsheet, when you step out of the comforting illusions of the crowd, the initial reward is almost never a parade.
History proves this unequivocally. Socrates had the immense moral courage to question the foundational beliefs and unquestioned assumptions of ancient Athens. He tried to wake his city up, and for his effort, he was put to death.
And Seneca, who gave us the tools to manage our fears, was exiled.
The great Stoic philosopher Epictetus was exiled too. Courage, by its very nature of disrupting the comfortable norm, frequently angers the majority.
You must be prepared to endure profound loneliness first. You must be willing to wander in the wilderness, sometimes for years, before your actions are vindicated by time or history. The path of virtue is thorny, and society often throws a few extra branches in your way just to test your resolve and see if you'll retreat to the comfort of the crowd.
Which brings us to a final provocative thought for you to carry into your week. We've talked about overriding biology, about banging rocks together to dispel the nebulous dark, and finding those 30 seconds of fortitude to break the inertia of fear.
Right.
But as you look at your own life, your own workplace, your own community, consider this. The wilderness today doesn't usually look like an ancient forest or a literal exile. In an age of digital echo chambers and instant ubiquitous backlash, the modern wilderness is often our comment sections and our social circles.
That is a profound shift in how we experience isolation.
Right. So ask yourself, is true modern courage just the willingness to step out of your ideological tribe? Is it the bravery to change your mind in public, knowing you will be attacked by the very people who used to applaud you?
It's a tough question.
It is. The temporary warmth of the crowd is incredibly seductive, but you have to ask yourself if that warmth is truly worth the permanent chill of knowing you compromised your own character to keep it.
That is the ultimate question of our set Arete. Are you willing to be temporarily uncomfortable to be permanently excellent?
Thank you for tuning in to Speak Up English Hub for this in-depth exploration. We hope this challenged your perspective and elevated your understanding of what it actually takes to be brave. Keep pushing your language skills and keep pushing your boundaries. Remember, the next time the silent alarm goes off and everyone else is running for the comfortable exit, maybe your job is to stay. Take care, everyone.
Thanks for being with us. See you on our next video. Let's speak up.